Hey, everybody, this is Garrett Justice, host of Brandland. Before we jump into this episode today with Sadie Koehler, I want to introduce my co host for today, Jessica Kulchuk, who is the Associate Creative Director on my team at Lucid Press. Jess, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing great. With this being your first time joining, I wanted to make sure that our listeners had a little bit of background on you and your career so far. I'm excited, for this episode that you'll hear here shortly. I think that we just got off recording that. I think we added a ton of value with your perspective, your experience, and also Sadie's. But I think it'll be important for our listeners to know a little bit more about you. So tell us a little bit more about your career and background.
Yeah, I feel like I've had a little bit of a untraditional path, but also maybe that's not so true after having just listened to a little bit about Sadie. But yeah, so I actually have a degree in architecture, which is like I think the first thing that's kind of a little bit different. But outside of school, I had joined a small boutique design firm. There was just like five of us total. And it was really cool because I got to learn, all about branding, all about the like creative process, like hands-on and how you work with, our clients, all different industries, like learned so much about horses, which is so weird. I could tell you all about that. And then from there, I actually got the opportunity to go work in nonprofit and film with Sundance Institute and Film Festival. And that was super cool too, because again, small team, first time working in-house, learned all about how a brand gets applied to all facets, right? Like everything down from like a little button to large environmental graphics to how you build an app, a website, screen washes, like everything you never thought you would know about. I got to do that and then ultimately, grow my career there by being a production designer and growing up to senior designer where I was actually overseeing those processes, right? Working with agencies to build a brand, working internally to redefine our brand. And then from there, did a couple of years of, growing my own business, again, working with small clients. And now I'm here, excited to rejoin a team. And it's super fun to just like take all those facets and like figure out how they actually apply to brands moving forward. And I think it's just been fun to learn how every experience kind of informs a different facet of how you approach design and how you approach a brand. So it's been super fun.
Yeah, that's awesome. The thing that Jess didn't tell you is she's also an excellent baker. So if you ever have baking questions, she's the person to go to ask about that. So Jess, we are super happy to have you on the Lucid Press team. We feel so fortunate to have you and your expertise. And I think this was an awesome episode that we just recorded with Sadie. So we hope all of you listening enjoy. Let's get into the show. Welcome to the next episode of Brandland. I'm the host, Garrett Justice, and today I'm also joined by my co-host here, Jessica, who is our Associate Creative Director on our team at Lucid Press. Jess, how's it going today?
It's going pretty well. Also, everyone bear with me. I'm camera shy. I like being behind it, not on it. So I apologize.
That's okay. That's why we're a podcast first here, even though we record a little video sometimes. So that's all right. Jess, it's great to have you and excited to leverage your expertise today. And I want to introduce our guest as well, Sadie Koehler, who is the Associate Creative Director at Principal Financial Group and also owner and freelance designer at her own company, Fresh Image. Sadie, how's it going?
Good, good. I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on the show today.
No, I'm really excited to have you and to dive into our topic today. And one of the reasons why we wanted to invite Jess to be with us as well is both of you seem to have such similar backgrounds here with doing freelance design and being, associate creative directors in-house. And so excited to talk to both you today about this topic of running successful design consultations, whether that's internally or with clients externally. Before we do that though, Sadie, tell us a little bit more about your career and your background.
Yeah, sure. So I started my career as a graphic designer at a full service marketing agency. I stayed there for a couple of years and then I moved and that's when I started freelancing full time, actually for 4 years. So during that stint in building up a freelance clientele, I worked with a lot of solopreneurs that were wanting to start businesses. I also worked with some smaller companies that just didn't have in-house design teams. So like I said, I did that for 4 years. And then around 2015 is kind of when I heard about this gig at Principal. Principal Financial Group is the company that I work at today. So I took that job, and my current title, like you mentioned, Garrett, is the Associate Creative Director. And I've now worked there for 5 years. So what my role kind of entails today is I manage a team of 5 designers, and they work with marketers and business partners all across the enterprise on various collateral, event design. We partner with the UX team for web graphics, layouts, social media, and we've recently added animation capabilities as well. One other thing that our team takes care of is we review a lot of work that our agency partners produce for the company as well. The area that I work in, it's called Content Studio. The studio is really a full service in-house agency. We have teams that cover writing, video, photo, audio, translation services. I mentioned a lot of the specifics of the design team, and then an accounts team that kind of wrangles all the creatives and keeps us on track with everything. So really, we all work together to either be producing communications, reviewing creative from our external partners, just to make sure everything is consistent across the enterprise. So my role specifically is a combination of working with the design team to make sure they have what they need. It's a lot of creative governance since we have so many people touching the brand, and also managing and evolving the visual aspect of the brand guidelines and partnering with the UX teams, sometimes on projects, but they are working today to update the design system that our digital properties pull from. So I work with them quite a bit to offer just a visual brand lens.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Well, I'm excited to dive in with that background and expertise to our topic today. Before we do, though, I'm curious, what's the biggest difference between that in-house role at such a big company like Principal Financial versus the freelance work that you do on the side for your own company? I imagine that there are some major differences there, but what would you say is the biggest?
It's a great question. I remember when I first started at Principal, everybody was like, "You went from freelance to Principal," because it's a really large company in Des Moines, and it's a retirement investment insurance company, so like a very corporate financial based company. Well, the biggest difference, though, let me back up. I feel like one of the similarities and what was kind of cool about the position, the way that my boss framed it before I took the job, was that we're building a team in this company. So it's really interesting having this small creative team amongst a lot of traditional corporate kind of marketing employees. So that said, it sounded to me like an opportunity where I could kind of do what I was doing with freelance, but within the larger construct of a company. And at the time they were also rebranding. So I was just fascinated by like, how does that work at a huge company like this? Like, how are you even gonna pull that off? You don't have any designers on your team. Like, how does that work? Yeah. So yeah. I was just so fascinated by that. But there's actually a lot more similarities than differences, I would say. But to answer your question a little bit more directly, I think the biggest difference is having to kind of keep track of all the different parts and pieces at a company this size to make sure that everyone's executing things in a consistent manner. So basically, like networking within the company, which is similar to freelance, but like freelancing, I didn't have to make sure every single person was consistent with each other. I was usually working with people on a one-on-one basis. Well, at Principal, it's so intertwined. It's a lot of making introductions and kind of pulling different pieces from across the enterprise to help explain to people like, we maybe shouldn't do that because look at all these other things. And so it's kind of, I would just say holding all the pieces together would probably be the number one difference.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Jess, I'm curious your perspective too. You just joined the Lucid Press team not long ago, and Lucid Press is obviously not as large of a company as Principal Financial, but you joined, having done freelance full time for a couple of years. So what was that change like from your perspective as well?
Yeah, I would say it's actually very similar to Sadie's points. And a lot of it is like, there's a lot of moving parts, but now I have a team to work with me, right? So I think like that's great. And I think, while you build your network externally as a freelancer, like now they're internal, right? Like I have our content specialist, I have our web developer, right? Everyone's on one goal. But I think for me, actually, I agree with there's a lot of more similarities. And I think the biggest thing for me, in my opinion, is that like you kind of treat your teams as like clients, right? So like even though we're an internal team and we're serving this company, like there's still like the same processes. You still have like your kickoff meetings. You still, need to know what the stakeholders want. So like, yeah, everyone's on mission for like the same brand, but it's very similar. Like you still kind of treat them as like your clients and your own little agency or, company. So it's fun. It's definitely a transition, but again, I love having a team and that's the best part in my opinion.
Awesome. Well, Sadie, I think that's a good segue kind of into our topic today, where we can dive into, tips for running successful design consultations. So, the first question I have for you, just to kind of get us started here, is whether it's, a freelance client that you're working with or an internal client there at Principal Financial, where do you typically start design consultations? When someone needs design help, what do you recommend doing to just kind of jumpstart that consultation?
Yeah, so to start off, I absolutely love this topic. So I'm excited to be chatting through it with you. I've just learned that so many designers are uncomfortable in consultation settings. So I talk to our designers a lot on a one-on-one basis to kind of help them navigate some of that discomfort and just the discomfort that happens in the meetings. So that's a little bit of the background on like why this topic is near and dear to me, because I just feel like there's a way to navigate around that discomfort to make both the designer and the marketers or whatever client you're working with a little bit more comfortable in having the conversation. So going back to your question about where do we start, this really varies on a few different things. Like, have I worked with this person before? How much do I know about their role or their area? We have a form at Principal that asks for things like objectives and other details about the project. So a lot of times I use that as a diving off platform to start asking some questions. But really taking some of that information that I already know and saying like, hey, so I saw you mentioned this when you submitted the request form. Tell me more about that. So it really starts out with a lot of open-ended questions and then gets a little bit more specific. So I think just being in the financial services industry, there's a lot that I do not understand at all. So sometimes sitting in these consultations, especially when I was newer, I would just kind of have this look on my face like, oh my gosh, like I have no idea what they're talking about. These people are so smart. Like, how am I going to know what to do at the end of this? So I feel like I've kind of developed these hacks over time just to make myself more confident in these consultations. And now it's something that I'm able to share with the rest of the team. So a lot of times, if you're on the client end of things, don't be surprised if your designer, when they're in the consultation, is probably thinking like, oh wow, this person's super smart, I don't understand anything they're saying. So like ultimately that all sounds very self-deprecating, but it's a real problem, and you tend to spiral sometimes into something close to like, I'm horrible at consultations, I'm horrible at my job. I mean, that's a really extreme case, but it does happen, and it really paralyzes designers from getting that information that you actually need out of the consultation, just because it feels very like almost tense sometimes until you find ways to actually cut that tension. So what I found helpful is to jot down notes about only the things that are really relevant to getting that work done. And then once I've got those notes as kind of a construct, once they're done kind of answering my open-ended questions, then I can dive in and say things like, help me understand this specific thing, or what I hear you saying is this, just to make sure. Like a lot of times, like I can get there generally, but I'm always questioning, like, am I understanding this correctly? And so just kind of getting that validation from them is always helpful. So 2 phrases, help me understand, and what I hear you saying is, kind of really helps me in those early stages of kicking off the conversation.
I really love those questions, because I think that, what I'm hearing you say there too is you don't have to be an expert on whatever the topic your client is, right?
Exactly.
You're an expert on the design. What you got to be good at is just asking the right questions, right? To help you discover and understand and help them bring you along. And really those good design consultations are when you bring your design expertise and you combine it with the expertise that they have on their business, or in this case, financial services or whatever it is. Yeah. And together, that's where you can create something that's really strong and impactful, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Design it's a team sport. And with the growing UX industry too, like there's so many different like design thinking frameworks that kind of help facilitate some of those conversations as well. So that's really fun material to dig into as well. It just kind of marries all of the people with all of the information. So like sometimes I just say, like, I'm just the hands. I'm trying to translate what you're telling me right now and what you need into visuals. And so that actually is something we'll probably touch on a little bit later in terms of presenting the work back to the client.
Awesome.
I have to just jump in for a second, because Sadie, I kind of agree with you. I love the consultation process. Like I kind of feel like we're little investigators, and like, again, similar, I started at Lucid Press, and like tech was kind of outside of my world, right? Like was definitely more creative. So it's been a whole process of learning. And like, I've definitely had those moments of like, what does that mean? I don't know what this is shorthand for, which has actually kind of been fun. And I don't know about you, but like, I think like then those questions, like I love that lens of like, I have no idea what you're talking about, because then you get to like figure out like, oh, how do we then, have this outward facing for other people who don't know, right? Like, how do we actually sell this to somebody or explain it in a way that makes sense? It's like a giant creative puzzle, which I love, all those moving pieces. And I guess ultimately, leads me to the next question of like, what comes next? How do you keep those clients, once you've kind of heard what they have to say, like, how do you keep it moving? How do you keep them engaged and, invested in this process?
Yeah, so I think the key to a good design consultation is so that the designer is walking away from that meeting with all the information they need to do the work, but then the client's walking away from that meeting feeling really excited and confident that their designer understands the ask, that the designer is going to come back with something that hits the mark, and ultimately just clarity around some of the next steps. I think one of the more stress-inducing thing that happens in some of these meetings is everything feels like a rush, like, oh, I needed this yesterday. So then when you start talking about timing, but like I just got the information and I'm really absorbing that and kind of swirling around, like, okay, what am I going to do with this? Well, then they drop the bomb. I'm like, but I need this probably faster than what you can actually produce this in. So one thing that I always tell my team is don't ever commit to a deadline when you're in that consultation, because I feel like that's when people always start stumbling around, like, oh, let me think of what else do I have on my plate, and so on and so forth. Well, it's so much simpler to just be like, you know what, let me get back to you on that. I need to check on a couple of things, and I'll give you a more solidified timeline that you can expect to hear back from me. I'll get back to you with that by the end of today or in the next hour, or whatever makes sense. So you're committing to something. You're just not committing to like when you can actually hand that project back to them. A couple of other things that are really good that I mentioned is just so that the client's walking away feeling excited and confident. One of the phrases I mentioned earlier was, so what I'm hearing you say is, well, when you recap something in the client's words, that's really telling them that you're understanding what they're asking for. And ultimately that's helpful just to gain their confidence, to gain their trust that you know what you're doing, and you're going to walk away. You're still going to collaborate with them, but right now the ball is in your court. You're going to take a stab at executing this from a visual standpoint. And then another thing I like to do too is just tell them like, hey, I think I have enough information to get this going. I think once I start on it, I'm probably going to have some more specific questions for you, and just say like, so do you want me to message you on Teams, email? Like what's the best way to kind of collaborate on this together? Just so it's setting that expectation that it's not going to be like me going away for 3 days and scrolling away on their project and then like, ta-da, here's your thing. Like they've already probably seen a couple of things, and then it just leads to a little bit more of a fruitful conversation once you do reconnect and review the whole piece.
So I guess to kind of summarize some of those tips that I heard you share, and correct me if I'm wrong, or help me if I miss anything here, but
Okay.
First is not committing to a specific deadline in that initial kickoff or consultation meeting. Instead, commit to get back to them by a certain time, whatever makes sense. And so you have time to go and process and figure out, okay, how long is this really going to take? What are my other priorities? Talk about then how they prefer to be communicated with, right? Whether that's through, Teams or Slack or email or whatever it is, right?
Yep.
And so that you can set expectations there, and and then you help them leave, confidently when they understand, okay, I'm going to get something back by this time and I'm going to be included along the way. And we've talked about how to do that. Is that right? What I miss?
Yeah, I think you hit all of the nails that I just laid out there, but I'm kind of chuckling because it's not a lot different than what you just did with me there. Like, I just listened to you say this. Here's the things that I heard you say. And I'm like, yeah. And I'm like, oh, that's actually exactly what we're talking about here. But it's really no different than that.
That's awesome. Good. Well, I'm glad that we could show that kind of in action then. That was unscripted there. So Sadie, my next question though, for you is, you've kind of set these expectations, you've gathered the information in this process, you're getting, the client leaving excited about, next steps and that you can help them. But, ultimately in the end, you kind of hinted at, you're showing them some work along the way. So it's not just like, ta-da at the end, but in the end, you're essentially going to have to present and sell this finalized work to the client and get feedback on it. So talk us through that process when you get to that point. What are the kind of tips or steps that you take as you kind of get to that ending point?
Yeah, so I've got a few pointers here. The first thing is really just at the very beginning. And let's say the framework is that you meet face to face or on a Zoom call or something, and the designer has the opportunity to actually walk through the work. I know there's probably situations where you just have to email it and talk through an email, but let's say you do have the opportunity to chat. So I'd usually open up the meeting just setting expectations and saying like, hey, thanks so much for being available when I've had questions, or hey, it's been a few days since we've talked, and just kind of like touch lightly on where have we been. So setting that expectation, like where have we been, and then telling them how you're feeling about the project. Like a lot of times I'm feeling if it's the final deadline, but like maybe I'm expecting another draft. I'll say like, I'm feeling really good about this. I feel like this is making a lot of sense based off of the last conversation that we've had, but I have a couple of areas where I want to dig a little bit deeper with you. I've got something for us to review, but just know that like, I'm thinking it might not be the final point in that. So that just gives me a little bit of wiggle room to open up a conversation. And there's been times that they're like, no, I think that's good. Like, let's just move on from that. But on the other side of that, like sometimes it just sets the expectation enough. So if it's not quite what they're expecting, or if it's not quite hitting the mark, then they're more comfortable. It's kind of an invitation to say, give me some feedback on this. Like, this is not my like, oh, this is my grand masterpiece and I'm gonna have hurt feelings if you make any comments. I really want them to be comfortable in being able to say like, I'm just not quite understanding that, or I think we could push this more. Because if I'm not creating a safe space for them to share that feedback with me, that's I feel when we tend to get off the tracks a little bit, where like we leave a consultation and then it's another draft and another draft and another draft, and it's really hard to figure out like what is happening. Like usually we can have a draft 2, 3 maybe, but then it's close to final. So when you get a lot of drafts, that's usually a sign that something probably went wrong in the conversation at some point in the process, or there's the occasional somebody just completely changed their mind for whatever reason, for whatever driving factor there is. But so yeah, that's kind of a lot around just setting expectations. So then when you start actually sharing the work, a lot of times what I will do is say, so during the conversation, we talked about this, here it is, this is how I translated that visually. And that's where I just share as much as I can about the rationale behind it. Design is not just pretty pictures. We get requests all the time for just like, can you just take this and make this look better? And like on the surface, sure, that's what we do, but it's so much deeper than that, where it's about hierarchy and making sure the right message is getting across. Are we prioritizing the information in the appropriate manner? So really explaining that, like you told me that you wanted the end user of this thing to walk away with this content. So that's why it's large in this spot, because I want that to be the first thing that they see. So kind of almost training them and like how I'm interpreting their words into the visuals is really how I like to walk people through that. I do that some if it's just like an email exchange, but I know how much people love reading long emails too. So at times I've kind of tested different ways to deliver that, because there's nothing worse than opening your email and being like, oh, there's like 10 paragraphs there. So I try to manage that a little bit, but that's, I'd say, the sole reason why I like meeting in person. I just think it's a lot of information to digest when you're seeing it all in words. And I think the last thing I want to mention is I never go into one of these meetings saying, what do you think? And so that is probably one of the number one issues that we have. Since a lot of things are super fast turnaround times, a lot of times we'll just have to email something off, and the receiver will open it and they'll take a look and then they'll say, I don't understand, da 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 da. And so when you're leaving wiggle room for somebody to just say like, I don't like this, then they're going to say, I don't like this. But that's why the rationale part of the process is so incredibly important, because I feel like when you're just saying something like, what do you think? You're not really giving that design a fighting chance, so that the client is understanding all the thought that was put into it and why the design team did what they did.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think those are really great tips. And I think that we could probably dive into and have like a whole dedicated episode just on this section, because there's so much to like unpack here, right? One of the things that I'm most interested though is I love how you talked about creating a safe space so that people can feel free to express their opinions. But I also really liked that you talked about the context of, this is what you told me, and that's why this is big here, right? Because that's the most important thing. So you're kind of teaching people how, like bringing them along in your thought process of why things are the way that they are. But I'm curious, like the balance there of how do you strike that right balance of having people feel comfortable enough to share their opinions without getting to that point where you have 50 iterations of something, or people are giving you feedback on things that are just like more in your expertise rather than their expertise, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. So I'm trying to think of a specific example to help me answer this question. There's so many details that go into every individual piece that for certain projects, I feel like you can kind of control that by way of managing the conversation and directing their attention. So, like, if there's an area where you feel like, oh, this is what they wanted, but I don't think that's gonna work, or I tried it and it didn't look good. There's sometimes like I'll share multiple options and say, here's what I think you were telling me. I don't think that works because of this reason, this reason, this reason. A lot of people don't want to say like, but I still want you to do it if your rationale is buttoned up enough and they can see clearly that you actually thought through this and you tried. Like sometimes trying is all that it takes. And that's kind of a common issue I see too, is like a lot of designers have this ability to almost like design things in their head. And then they're listening and they're thinking, that is not going to work. That's a horrible idea. But I'll say, just put it on paper. Just spend a little bit of time on it. Like, you know that it's not going to work. They don't know that that's going to work. And it's going to really help them understand why it doesn't work if you allow them to see it. And so one of the things is just really trying to understand like what they're saying, and then really trying to explain to them why that's a terrible idea. Don't do that. Another thing that I had thought about is going back to kind of like directing attention. There's sometimes where I'm thinking, okay, we have an hour to walk through this. We're not going to have time to touch on everything. So like one of two things, either kind of like talk through that and move on. And then if they go back to it, then you know there's something problematic with that from their perspective. Or like if they don't go back to it, then it's like, okay, well, I'm going to take that as approval because I'm going to send this email recap, and that's their opportunity to kind of explain like if that's not what they wanted. So that's kind of like a little bit of a passive approach to get around it. Otherwise, like hitting it head on, if you really think like they were really passionate about that thing, like that's when I would go with kind of the approach that I previously mentioned, and just like hitting it head on and saying like, hey, I know that I did not do what you were asking me to do. So let's say you didn't have the opportunity to actually try the approach that they were wanting. Here's all of the reasons why I think this might be a better approach. But I mean, with all of these things that I'm sharing, it really just goes back to like, you don't want to be so forceful where it kind of just shuts down the conversation, because that can happen sometimes too, where it's just like, they didn't do this thing, and now I don't even know if they're going to be open to me sharing these other ideas. So it's kind of a fine line to walk. I don't ever want people to think that it's a forceful conversation in any way. So that's where like just relying on rationale and logic and explanation is always kind of my preferred approach.
Yeah, I like that. Jess, I'm curious your perspective on this too. How do you typically manage, creating a safe space where people can feel comfortable sharing feedback, but also managing it so it doesn't turn into too much or too long of an engagement that's never ending?
Yeah, I agree with, and we'll probably echo a lot of what Sadie had said, but I think ultimately, like, it comes down to relationship building, right? Like, the whole point of the consultation and the process is like, you're building that trust, you're listening to them. And I think, once you've established that trust, like, there's always hiccups, right? But like, to Sadie's point is like, you're the expert, right? And they've hired you for a reason, whether it's internally or, a client and freelance. And so, like, you always explore what they're looking at, and, to the point of like, it may not be right. I think there's something valid in like, the exploration probably taught me something I might not have thought about, even if I thought it wasn't the right solution, right? But also like, you kind of like build credit by just exploring it. So like, I think it's just kind of like, hey, like, we tried it, it didn't work, but also like, this is my opinion. And, like it's that trust. Like you just have built that trust. It goes through the whole process. And I think like also by reminding them kind of like what the goals were, you kind of get to revisit that and say like, hey, this was our initial goal, right? And like I think sometimes that reminder is super helpful too, because they're like, oh, you're right. So like that didn't accomplish it. And your rationale and like your thought process really does put us like in the direction we wanted. And I think like they actually appreciate that, right? Like, and I think just knowing that you considered what they wanted, but also that you're like, hey, this is why I'm doing this and this is my thought behind it, really just builds that trust and like lets everyone get that buy-in.
Yeah, I love that. I was thinking the same thing, that it really comes down to just building trust and building a strong working relationship there where you both feel comfortable expressing opinions while still respecting the opinions of others. I mean, it's pretty basic stuff, but sometimes it's harder to do in action. It's like easy to talk about, hard to make happen. But I think that the tips that you both shared are good, tangible, actionable tips to make that happen. So I guess, Sadie, as we get close to wrapping up here, the last question I really have for you then is, how do you, what's that post consultation engagement, or what type of things do you do post consultation to really strengthen that relationship and make it the most impactful consultation then going forward after you have kind of agreed on, finalized the output and handed it off?
Yeah. So I really think the key thing here is just email recaps. Here's what we decided on during the meeting. Did I miss anything? Here are the details. Here's the deadlines. Here's the next steps. People just tend to talk really fast during meetings and might not catch everything. So I think one, it's just not a great practice to rely on anyone's memory. So sending email recaps is yet another tactic to use to just help you build that trust with the client that you're working with, and just clarifying expectations. I cannot stress enough how important clarification of expectations will make the difference in how the project goes. So yeah, post consultation, whether it's the kickoff, whether it's sharing your work, it's really just great to make it a habit to send out email recaps to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, makes total sense. Jess, anything you'd add there?
Still learning the unmute button. But no, I think I agree. The recaps just help like be notes, right? Like there's just something to always come back and check. And I think that's the biggest thing along with managing expectations. Like as long as people have a direction, like there's somewhere to go and you feel comfortable.
Yeah, makes total sense. Well, Sadie, thank you again so much for taking the time to spend with us today. I think this has been awesome. I think that there's been some really great tips, tangible things that, listeners out there can hopefully take back and apply in their own design consultations. Or if they're on the other side, as marketers or kind of those internal clients, things that they can do to make that consultation better. So appreciate you sharing your tips and your insight with us today. As we wrap up here, if there are listeners who want to follow up with you or get a hold of you to, ask follow-up questions, what's the best way for people to connect with you?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn, or you can shoot me an email. My freelance email is usually the best way to get a hold of me. So that's sadie@freshimage.com. And Garrett, engaging with your team has made me realize that I'd love to get this type of content into some sort of shareable format. So it'll be a while till something like that's done. But if anybody is listening to this and is actually interested, just kick me an email, because it's something that I'd be happy to just share out a copy with you for.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm sure would love that. I would love it after this too, because I think it's been some awesome, tangible tips. So Sadie, thanks again for taking the time today. Hope you have a great rest of the day.
Yeah, you too. Thanks to both of you.
Thanks.